Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Landon Williams, and we're going to talk about God's work in Chile. Landon, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate the invitation.
Let me tell you about Landon. Landon Williams is the Santiago Global City Leader with the International Mission Board. Landon and his wife, Megan, were appointed as IMB missionaries in 2018 to serve the Lord in South America, along with their three children, Emery, Penn, and Mary Margaret. As leaders of the IMB's Santiago Global City team, they launched the James Journey. We'll hear more about that as we go. That initiative as a citywide vision to stimulate gospel flow into, within, and out of Chile's capital. Landon has previously served as the senior pastor of Hillview Baptist Church in Graniteville, South Carolina. He has also served as minister of music and youth in two SBC churches in Alabama. And Landon, I have to say that probably being a minister of music and student minister prepares you for the mission field or about anything that you might possibly experience.
It definitely does. It prepares you for how to navigate relationships and certainly a lot of different types of opportunities that come your way. So learning different dynamics in ministry, that was a great training ground for so many things that have come in the last 15 years since then.
I'm so glad to have this time with Landon. Folks are going to love him and love hearing about the partnership that Kentucky Baptists have with the International Mission Board through Landon and his team. So Landon, let's jump right into these questions. Tell us the short story of how you came to trust in Jesus for salvation, and then the missionary calling that came to your life.
Sure. Well, obviously the most important decision that I've made in my life was the one to trust God's call on my life when he began to call me to himself at a young age and to lean into his plan for my life, to recognize that I am a sinner, that I was at the time, that I continue to be in need of the saving grace of Jesus. And so we're really want to highlight just the importance of that decision and really appreciate you asking that question. I was raised in a Christian home. My father was a pastor. And from a young age, I remember my father, my mother, and those around us in our church sharing the gospel faithfully. Many times I would come home after school and my dad would say, "Landon, I want you to come into the living room. Come into the living room. Let's have a talk." And he would want to talk about what I understood about the gospel. And I remember those conversations fondly. But I was never ready to surrender, to submit. I did understand the gospel in my head, but my heart wasn't ready. And then finally, when I was in finishing fifth grade, it was actually, I remember very, very clearly, it was the last day of fifth grade. We just finished school, and there was a group of children and young students from our church that were headed to some activity that the kids had going on to finish the school year. And my father and a group of senior adults were headed down to an evangelism rally where a guy named David Ring was preaching. And so I elected, by God's providential grace, to go with my dad and the senior adults. I don't know why, other than the fact that it was just God leading in my heart to do so. And so at that service, I gave my life to Christ when he challenged us to trust what God could do with someone who would give their life to him, who would trust him, to repent of my sin, to accept Jesus' forgiveness, to allow him to come into my heart, transform me. And that began my walk with Christ. And that was an important time. But as a young child, obviously moving into my teenage years, I continued to grow. And the Lord would nurture me, learning what it means to own my faith as a young adult. And so when I was 17, the Lord called me to ministry. But I ran from that call for a number of years. And it concluded with me failing out of college 3 times.
Oh, well.
No one thought I would ever finish.
Yep.
Just kind of had left myself to just kind of wandering through life without a lot of discipline. But at 21, the Lord reminded me that I had surrendered to a call to ministry when I was 17. And when I surrendered to that call, God began to do an incredible work in my heart, to draw me into him, to refine the things that were defining my life, a lack of discipline, just wandering through life without a lot of direction, and certainly without a course or without a plan for my life. And so as God redeemed my story, I began to serve him in ministry. Fast forward until 2005, and I was on a trip to Brazil, and the Lord called me to missions. Several years later, as I was serving in those churches in Alabama, God convicted me that it was time to go. And I served for the first time with IMB from 2009 through 2011, at which point I met my wife, Megan, and she was also serving with IMB in a different part of the world. So at the end of our terms, we came home, we got married, we served the Lord in the pastorate. And one evening, Gordon Ford, who was senior vice president with the IMB for many, many years and led our work overseas and has had a number of different roles, he was preaching in the church that I pastored. And I remember him giving a challenge to the mostly senior adults that were gathered from a number of different churches on the Super Bowl Sunday night. And he said, my challenge to you this evening is that you would bless your grandchildren and give them your blessing to be able to serve the Lord overseas, wherever he might call them. And he was going through a time in his life when his first grandchild was born. But God spoke to me in the middle of his challenge to those senior adults in the room, and he said, Landon, I want you to take your children. And as I began to open the word and pray through what God was telling me, he reminded me of that call on my life from the years before. And in Psalm 137, in the first couple of verses, it says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we thought of Jerusalem. And they were mocked for their singing, the Israelites were. They said, how can we sing songs of joy, when our city is in shambles? And God rekindled in my heart a desire to return to the mission field. And that was when God convinced us that it was time to take the next step in ministry. And just a little over a year later, we landed in Santiago, Chile.
Landon, wonderful story. You mentioned a calling coming to you when you were on a mission trip in Brazil. Lots of pastors take trips like that. They take teams, and lots of pastors would have a testimony that when they're there, they have a strong sense of, I'd love to do this forever. But in many cases, they get back home, and that sense of urgency kind of dissipates. How was your calling, what you experienced in Brazil? How is it different than that? How did it just stick with you? Was it the time when Gordon preached it was just all stirred back up, or how is that different?
Well, I think ministry, as you've experienced, Todd, in your life, comes in seasons, and sometimes the Lord gives us a call, and that call leads us into further preparation. So the call, I think, when I was in Brazil was very, very clear. And we continued to go back to Brazil with the group from our church, and I went from participating to leading some of those teams. And so along the way, God was doing little things in my life that would prepare me. I was studying theological education, preparing myself for a career in missions and to be eligible to be appointed as an IMB missionary. And then shortly thereafter, in God's grace too, as we see just the power of the cooperative program at work. And when I was in serving in the second of the churches in Alabama during this season, we hosted at the Alabama Baptist State Convention that year a sending celebration, and many IMB missionaries were appointed. And this was in those months after I had been in Brazil for the first time, and God called me, and the Lord just solidified in my heart, even at that sending service, that was what he was calling me to do, and that IMB was the conduit through which God would eventually use us. And so I think, to answer your question, when the call is clear, when the call is there, as we walk with God through different seasons, He's going to direct us and sharpen us. And I can see how the different things that I've done in ministry throughout the years, it's been 20 years of full-time ministry coming up this next March, are things that God has used to prepare me even for what we're doing right now in Santiago, Chile.
Landon, how would you counsel, and I trust you've done this before, probably as a pastor and certainly as a missionary, how would you counsel that person who is experiencing what feels like a call to the mission field? Maybe a husband feels called that way, his wife may not feel that same strength of direction. How would you encourage him or them to kind of test out that call and discover how the Lord might be leading? What are 2 or 3 things they could do?
Well, I think the first thing, Todd, that's an excellent question. The first thing is just to remember that what Scripture says about husband and wife, the two have become one flesh. And so really leaning in and discerning what God's call is, not for us as individuals, but for our marriage and for our family. So I think that would be my first counsel, is always is sort of empty ourselves of the individualistic mindset sometimes that predominates that can at times predominate our theology, and say, God, what are you calling us to as a unit, as a family, as a marriage, as husband and wife? So that'd be my first counsel. Really surrender that from the perspective of marriage. And this other thing I would say is get counsel from someone who's done it before. Spend time with someone who's done it. Ask them the questions. What does it take? What does it look like? Familiarize yourself with the process. Contact IMB. There's a team of people there ready to give you counsel, even if you're not prepared at the moment. They can help you understand what it would take to go. And the other thing I would say, number 3, is get cross-cultural experience, whether that's working with people in your backyard, teaching an ESL class, finding people in your community that need Jesus, who are immigrants, who are second language learners, et cetera, and really beginning to invest in them and see what God does in your own heart.
Yeah, that's great counsel. So we have to touch on this. You have Kentucky ties. Tell us about that.
I do. So I have a few Kentucky ties. My very first foray, as I was interviewing into full-time ministry, was actually at a church in Kentucky, in Central City, Kentucky. So I would say that was my very first tag. Went all the way back to the beginning. I was just a phone call away from being a Kentucky Baptist. So it was actually,
Muhlenberg County, that's as good as it gets right there.
That's exactly right. I was actually offered a position there, and Pastor Bob was pastor there at First Baptist Central City, made big, who died of cancer a few years ago, made a big impact on my life, even in that process. God ultimately led us in a different direction, but that was my first taste of Kentucky, and we fell in love with Kentucky. Obviously, Stephen Kunkel, Tim Kunkel's here on our team, and his son Stephen is serving in Japan, so that's a very strong tie that we have as well with Kentucky. So we're grateful for the different Kentucky Baptists out there that at different places in our life have made a mark on our ministry.
So Tim, talk a little bit about Chile and your current context of ministry. Tell us where you are, how long have you been there, what's it like where you are, and kind of what is your role with the internet? I mean, folks have a concept of a missionary, and it might not be really accurate to what your life looks like. So tell us, give us a little picture of that.
Yeah, that's good question. So we've been in Santiago going on 6 years. We were appointed in 2018, and we landed on the field in early 2019. And life on the field can vary from day to day, week to week, month to month, and even year to year. So just like life in the States, one has to live. You have to spend time with your family. You have different sorts of responsibilities. And so it is very different than what one would experience on a volunteer or a short-term mission trip. My responsibilities currently lie in leading the Santiago city team. I have some direct reports. So I do some direct supervision of about half of the personnel who are here in our city, but I also lead the strategy for all of the Santiago work here in our city, and so I'm the strategy coordinator as well for the work that goes on in Santiago. Being the only team here in Santiago as well, in Chile, we have a really unified approach to how we work across the city, and so I do a lot of collaborating and working with national leaders, with the leaders of the local Baptist Association, with the president of the Chilean Baptist Convention, and others, to help put us in a position to strengthen our partnerships here locally. Just believing that as we strengthen partnerships, we're going to be able to go much further. In addition to that, my wife and I planted a church here among the upper class of Santiago in the neighborhood of Vitacura, and that is one of the least reached places in all of Latin America. It's the second or third most expensive zip code in Latin America. So you can imagine some of the challenges that come along with that. We do have a passion for reaching the upper class. It's a very clear call that God gave to us as we were discerning where God would have us to serve.
Wow, very exciting. And so Chile, Santiago, a population of around 7 million people, I understand. Kentucky, by comparison, about 4.5 million, 4.6 for the whole state. So you mentioned a strategy. What is the strategy for reaching or impacting the city of Santiago? And then, Tim, talk a little bit about the process of developing that strategy. That's helpful for leaders everywhere thinking through their strategy for reaching their city. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I think anytime you talk about strategy, at least in my mind, Todd, I like to think from a 30,000-foot view and then begin to land the plane.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we think about missions in general throughout Latin America, we work in what I like to call in two words, a legacy context and also in pioneer fields. So what that means is that we're surrounded uh, by other national partners. There are churches around us. The gospel's penetrated large parts of Latin America. But there are pioneer fields. There are hard to reach places. They're last frontiers in Latin America. And they're that way for a reason, because they've been hard to penetrate over many, many years. And so we're looking at both of these contexts, both how do we work in a legacy context with partners, but also how do we engage these last frontiers, this pioneer work in Chile. What I would say in particular then, as we land that plane, our strategy is twofold. It's investing in national partners, it's investing in Chileans to help them, to encourage them, to resource them, to dream with them, to pray with them, to give them the different things that they need. That encompasses its own strategy. And that's one of the areas where the KBC is really able to help us land the planes. We're excited about the partnership with the Kentucky Baptist Convention, and about the number of people that God has stirred in their hearts to come and partner with us here. And because of that, we've already made tremendous advances in our ability to get to the table with Chilean partners and begin to think about how can we make concrete plans to help churches across our city. But the other side of that is their upper classes that are unreached and have been for many, many years. Santiago has one of the largest upper middle class communities in all of Latin America, maybe the largest in terms of percentage, and certainly the largest sort of consolidated geographical area. We have 1 million people that are living in an area which you could draw a circle around or just draw a line around. And this area is less than 2% reached, and less than 0.5% are going to attend church in their comuna, we call it here in Chile, in their neighborhood on any given Sunday. Mm-hmm. So that's a dire need for reaching these people with the gospel. And so our strategy is twofold. It's to plant churches and to facilitate church planting and gospel impact among those in this pioneer, last frontier part of Santiago, and to assist and to aid our national partners in how they can begin to advance the gospel, to eventually to join us in our work in the upper class part of Santiago, but also how they can be on mission in their local communities, in the rest of Santiago and Chile, and to the ends of the earth.
So, Landon, take a minute or two and tell us about the process of developing that strategy. Do you give leadership to that? Do you work with your team on determining the city strategy? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I give leadership to that effort. I've participated in a number of different trainings. Just recently, we're finishing a 3-year process that deals with an urban cohort, which is part of one of IMB's initiatives of 75 global cities across the world that we want to engage, Santiago being one of those. And so that's been a part of the process of developing the strategy. But we also work with our local team. We listen in to what the desires and how God's speaking to those here on the local team. And our desire is to set a large field. And so once we've determined what these areas are, applying that strategy and then overseeing that strategy is working with the missionaries that God has sent us and those who God wants to send us to say, here's the field of play that God has given us, that we've sensed that together that God has set apart for us to work in, and then to work with them to discern the Lord's call on their life and what role they can play within that field of play. So I like to use the analogy of a soccer field and to say once the borders have been set and we know what the parameters are, the coach's job is to work with people to help them figure out where their skills are best used. And I use this analogy, Todd, often. If someone comes to me and says, or I say to them, I would like for you to play striker, which is the guy who's up front trying to make the goals. Mm-hmm. And the person comes to me and says, Coach, I really want to play defense. I have two options. I can say, go play striker because that's what's going to be best, or I can let them go play defense and let them figure out where their strengths are. Mm-hmm. Either one, they may surprise me and I may find out something I never knew, or they may figure out for themselves that God wants to redirect them in a different direction. Sure. And I think that strategy really works well on the mission field when it comes to designing a strategy and also applying the strategy on the field.
So, Landon, you were a pastor before I moved to the mission field. I've always felt like that missionaries, in one sense, have a little bit of an advantage in their work. That you went to Chile to impact Santiago with the gospel. That's why you're there. Pastors, and when you were serving at Hillview, what was the name of the church? Hillview Baptist Church. That was part of your work, impacting the city with the gospel. But you had a church to pastor, a lot of responsibilities that went to the members of the congregation of that church, and that's not untrue for the mission field either. So, in your view, should every pastor have a strategy for reaching their city with the gospel, or their county or community? And if so, what are 2 or 3 things a pastor in the States could do to begin to develop a strategy like you're describing for Santiago?
Right. But I think, again, I want to lean into that question. I think developing a strategy, understanding what your vision is for any leader, if we're thinking about as a pastor in particular in this context, I think it's going to be essential to the success of your ministry. Obviously, we know the Lord gives success, but and we need to be faithful to that. But the Lord, I think, has given us some general principles. And so a couple things, Todd, that I would just point out. I think if you can understand your demographics, that's going to go a long way. That's something we've done here in Santiago. We understand our demographics. We know the size of our city. We know how it's broken down in terms of government and how it functions. We understand where the main arteries are in our city. So just a lot of demographic type of things, infrastructure questions, understanding where you're located and really owning that. So if you're located in a rural part of your city, you want to own that area first, but then figure out how can you connect and move into other parts of the city. And I think that's where partnerships come into play. So if having a strategy is important, and wanting to saturate your own city as a pastor is important, I think part of that comes with just the knowledge of where you are. The other side of that equation, Todd, I think, is building out partnerships and relationships.
That's great.
To help you do that. And if I can just give one practical tip.
Please.
One of the things that we did in a small town in Alabama was we developed a relationship with churches of other ethnicities. So there were Hispanic churches, there were also African-American churches. We were predominantly a Caucasian church. But as we began to develop relationships with others, we found ourselves in a better position to be able to minister to those and each person that we came into contact with. So as we can build out multi-ethnic teams across our city and realize that we're not the only ones that God has tasked with reaching our city. So even at the local level, leaning into partnerships, I think would go a long way for helping people.
That's outstanding.
And then the third thing,
please.
and then the third thing I would say that a good strategy does for you, it allows you to build expectancy, it allows you to speak to your people, it allows you to challenge them, whether that's being a pastor, a missionary leader, or even executive director of a state convention. If you have a good, clear vision, then you can build expectancy among your people. You can challenge them with a God-sized vision, and that's going to go a long way as well for people being able to capture what it is that God has in store for their lives.
That's very, very helpful. So, Landon, a short list. So if you were to list 2 or 3 blessings for either for you or your family of serving as a missionary, what would those be? Then if there were a couple of challenges that a family might experience, what would those be?
Well, I think one of the blessings is we have to lean into one another. And so the strong family dynamic, building a tight-knit family with our children, with my wife and I together, I think that is a tremendous blessing. I think you can't understate the blessing of being able to experience life in another culture. Can't understate the blessing of our children being given the opportunity to learn a second language from childhood to natively bilingual. So those are just material blessings. And you also can't underestimate the blessing of what it is when you see people's lives transformed with the gospel and the satisfaction of knowing that God's used you, that in spite of our own weaknesses, in spite of our own limitations, God chooses to use our lives. So that's a tremendous blessing. I think the challenges kind of mirror all of those other things. Being apart from family, that's certainly a challenge. While it brings you together, it's definitely a challenge when you don't have that family network around you at certain times, certain seasons of the year. I think there's definitely a challenge when it comes to your own limitations cross-culturally. You enter into the culture as a baby, and it takes years, if ever, to sort of get to full cultural and linguistic fluency. And so taking a step back and just constantly feeling that rub is a challenge.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. So you mentioned the Chilean partnership with Kentucky Baptist Convention and the work that you're doing. Describe that partnership to us and maybe help make the case for why other churches should consider being part of it. And it's gotten off to a great start. From all I can see, it's been hugely successful so far.
Well, yeah, so the KBC partnership has been, without question, the highlight of the last 6 years of ministry here. We've seen God do something really, really special. And I would encourage people to pray about partnering, because we've seen God begin to move across our city through this partnership. He's opening doors for new opportunities. And there are people, just like in the book of Acts, where the churches are saying, come over here and help us, just like the Macedonian call that came to Paul and his companions in the night with a vision. They're Chileans saying, we need your help, and we need your help. And the compelling vision would be God has prepared people who are saying in Chile, saying, we want to do this together. We're looking for help. And what a great opportunity to lean into something where there's an invitation. And the invitation is not just from IMB. The invitation is from our Chilean partners. And I think that speaks volumes as to how God has prepared a season and a place and a time for us to be able to impact Santiago with the gospel, to plant churches across our city, to start new works, to revitalize old works, and to do all number of things that God has in store for the people whom he loves and the people that he wants to hear the radical, life-changing transformation message of the gospel. Our partnership in general focuses on a commitment, and that commitment is the James Journey commitment. So we've talked about this initiative, and the James Journey is simply a process that people can come into, and it begins with a vision, and it begins within your heart saying, I want to be a part of this commitment. And that commitment is simply this: with Jesus at the center of my life, I will announce his kingdom, I'll move together in partnership, and I'll establish churches so that Christ may be exalted among the nations. And our challenge is, as people listen to that commitment, as they see it written down, that we have a file that's going to be able to be shared with people here as they connect. What we want to see is people pray over that and say, God, are you calling me to be a part of that? The James Journey in particular is about Santiago. It's about believing that from Santiago, God can transform a city, a country, and even the world. Yeah. That God can use right here in this city, can raise up a generation of people who can maybe become even the next Korea, where God raised up a generation of people from a city and from a country on the other side of the world to impact the lostness. So that's really our vision. James is the English translation of Santiago. And so that's one of the reasons that we chose the word James Journey. The other being James 1:5 is our key verse, because when you're reaching 7 million people, you need help. Not only do we need help from people, we need help from the Lord. And James 1:5 says, if any one of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all, beyond reproach. And so we know that we depend on Jesus. We depend on God to give us discernment and wisdom to help us understand how to accomplish this task of reaching 7 million people. And then finally, the James Journey is also the acronym for that commitment that we're challenging people to make. The James, with Jesus at the center, announcing his kingdom, and moving with partnership. E for establishing churches, and the S so that Christ may be exalted among all nations.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for explaining that, Landon, and thank you for your ministry. So last question, this platform is called Leadership Lessons. Tell us about a person, an experience, a Bible verse, a book, something that either shaped or transformed your own approach to leadership or that has helped you grow as a leader.
Well, the most impactful thing is often at the beginning. And for me, a pastor named Sam Davidson, who was the first pastor that I worked with in a small town in Alabama, an inner city church right outside of Birmingham, and in a place called Bessemer, Alabama. And Sam Davidson would say, ministry is 90% relationships, 90% relationships. And I've taken that with me everywhere I've been. God cares about people. The Lord is about a relationship. Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship with Jesus Christ. And so everything flows out of relationship, both in terms of in our heart, abiding in Christ, and also in our relationship with others as we minister to them. And so I think that's the most impactful thing that happened to me, the lesson that I've learned from the very beginning, and always taken that with me.
The great thing about that leadership lesson, Landon, is it's accessible to everyone.
Right.
Probably 90% of everything we do is showing up and being likable. And if you can show up and just be good to people, I mean, you're well on your way to leadership, leadership, even success. Brother, thank you for your ministry. Thank you for answering God's call. Thank you for serving with Southern Baptist, Kentucky Baptist. Thank you so much for hosting us as a ministry partner through this Chilean partnership. And thank you for taking the time to join Leadership Lessons today.
Thanks again, Todd. I really appreciate being here. Looking forward to seeing the next KBC team here March 13th through the 20th.
All right.
Of 2025. Looking forward to that.
Thank you, Landon.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Leadership Lessons. An audio podcast of this program is available on both Apple and Android devices. The Kentucky Baptist Convention was created by churches for churches to help churches reach Kentucky and the world for Christ. For more information about the KBC and the cooperative program which fuels our ministry, go to kybaptist.org. We'll see you next time on Leadership Lessons.